Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the CCA CRA. So the CRA features CCA's brand new dynamic driver technology. This is a very thin, fast, well-extended dynamic driver. Unfortunately, we can't really get a great look at it, so there's just some marketing talk, like I just said, that we know about it. But here is the CCA CRA up close, and even the design is a little bit new for CCA or KZ. It is, almost a 3/4 metal fingerprint magnet shell with 1/4 kind of smoked resin on that last little bit. Around the side, it actually does say CCA CRA, new generation acoustics. And as I mentioned, inside is sitting this brand new dynamic driver in that metal housing, so we can't really see it. But if you look at the website, you'll see that it is a very attractive, brand new thin diaphragm in their dynamic driver. So I do want to thank KZ for sending this out to me as a review sample. Many thanks to them for supporting me and other reviewers with review samples. So this is not the stock cable. This is actually the KZ SPC, so silver-plated copper with blue stripe cable. For those of you who are into upgrade cables, I highly recommend this one. It is the one I was actually listening to with the CRA. So I've talked about this one a few times, but never get to show it. So there you go. Stock cable is this one that we've seen before. So it's the 2-core flat copper cable. So still a nice cable, but not quite as special as the upgrade cable. So let's kind of jump into it really quickly and say, so CRA just came out. It seems like CRN came out a short time ago. It was only a couple weeks ago. So kind of right off the bat, if you read from left to right, the bass is actually quite different. So where CRN was a bit bass light, if you're into more bass, you would say CRN's a little bit bass light. I would say CRA is a little bass heavy, and this actually graphs pretty close to what ZAS does. So it is definitely on the heavier bass side of the KZ or CCA portfolio. So as I said, the CRN mids or bass was sort of designed to keep the mids super clean, so not a whole lot of energy coming into the mids. CRA does have a little bit more, whereas CRN kind of went across linearly into the mids. CRA is a little more V-shaped or U-shaped, and then as it sweeps up into the gain area, into the pin of gain area, so quite a bit different here. So as we talked about with CRN, it has this more gentle slope, a more natural, less fatiguing, way, as opposed to where KZ has bumped up in the past. So CRA isn't all that different, and the difference for me, to my ears, is actually this little bit right here. It's actually quite a bit different. So where CRN peaks at about, that's right at the beginning of 4K, and CRA is a little bit later into the higher fours, that's a big difference for me in fatigue level to my ears. You may not hear that at all, but to my ears, it's actually quite a bit different. And then the sort of as far as the treble extension and levels, you can kind of see that CRN is almost just as extended, but the levels are quite a bit lower than CRA, which is about what you would hear if you had both of them side by side. So when we talk about this new dynamic driver and the treble extension, it's not all that far extended from EDX. So you can kind of see EDX and CRA share pretty much the same peaks, except for the initial gain, like I said. So where EDX Pro is probably upper mid shouty to some people, you're not going to get that on CRA. It's a much smoother, easygoing rise, and then if you're 4K sensitive like me, or 5K, you'll hear it there. But as far as extension, pretty much the same extension, just the levels are actually bumped up quite a bit, and that's about what that sounds like to me. So if you're looking against sort of the benchmark of affordable dynamic drivers, sort of the king of the under $300 dynamic drivers, single dynamic drivers, 10 gems oxygen. So when we talked about this base level before, I said that CRA is quite a bit boosted. It's at the higher end of the KZ. Something that people would consider a more natural dynamic driver and bass level is, quite a bit lower than what CRA does. And even the same thing on the treble. To get a more natural sound, even though they have this upper mid emphasis right here, like I said that's earlier, the general treble level is quite a bit lower than what CRA is. And to my ears, that's just a more natural sound. Other people may prefer, boosted on both ends like that is. So just a quick look there compared to the king of dynamic drivers. So let's kind of jump right into it again. So right off the bat, so when other reviewers mention the CRA and that it might be a little peaky, that's me. This one for me is definitely on the peakier side, and it's not so much this variable peaky, like you hear levels rising up and down, it's not that. There's a couple peaks that are very intense to my ears, and that 4 to 5K one is one, and there's probably another one higher, but yeah, this was sort of if you're into mods, this is a mod candidate for me, where you want to take a whole range of upper treble values and bring them down a bit, and I think it'll probably sound fine. But kind of right out of the box, when other people mention being peaky, I hear that, and they're talking at me. So the odds of you having similar peakiness is kind of slim. I think the majority of people aren't even going to notice it, but I do definitely notice it, and do take that into consideration, that when I nitpick and criticize, you're probably not going to hear most of the things that I'm talking about, because having these peaks and in this upper treble region, it colors a lot of what the sound is and the levels, and it goes out of balance for me. So I don't know what to say. I could say, well, I don't hear it at all and this thing sounds awesome, but I'll sort of be brutally honest and tell you what it sounds like to me. So would I choose CRN or CRA? I would choose CRN for two main reasons. One, I think the mids are more natural with the same amount of detail and better texture. And that's not really a knock on CRA at all. It's actually kind of a compliment to how detailed the vocals in the midsection is on CRA. It's just that I think the balance with the pickiness is a little different on CRA than I get on CRN. So for me, CRN just sounds a little more natural, and I sort of prefer that compared to CRA. And then second, like I said, the CRA has this upper treble boosted, and it's too fatiguing for my ears. You probably won't hear that at all, but for me, this one just isn't a long session set. It's really hard to take after a while. But it definitely has that wow factor, and the minute you put it on, you definitely hear when they talk about extended treble and higher treble levels, faster, all that is this wow factor that you get for a few minutes. But after a few minutes, it's a bit fatiguing for me. So stock tips, I kept the stock tips. I think they work pretty well on this set, actually. These are not star tips. These are similar looking to star tips, same shape, but no actual star pattern on there. But as far as taming some of the upper treble peaks, I think they do a pretty good job for me. And they do tend to shrink the stage and imaging just a little bit. So the sound, like we talked about, it is kind of a UV shape. When we look at it here, it's a U shape because both sides are essentially boosted, and the U is really a minimal mid-bleed situation, and I think that sort of accurately describes what it sounds like. There's not a whole lot of bleed, and part of it is there's not a whole lot of energy coming in, and part of it is you have a brighter upper range, which tends to balance out this. So I think it's more U than V, but there's a little bit of V there to it, but not too bad. So UV leaning bright, like I said, you might hear that, you might not. It might be peaky for you, probably not, but it is for me. So like I said, the bass, again, graphs like a ZAS. This is ZAS level. It is quite boosted, high level. Bass fans of higher level fun bass will enjoy that. New driver, so it is faster and tighter, but I will still call it thick boosted. This level is still quite high. It still sounds kind of thick. And when we listen to those beginning open notes to helical trios, I can see clearly now. That bass should be even tighter, more defined. There should be space between the notes, and that would actually help out in the mids, making them even more clear and more detailed. So pretty good. I think the bass, I would call it more fun than maybe higher quality, or higher fun than higher quality. But when you look at the level, it was not going to be as tight and as fast as, say, a DQ6, which has a much lower level, or where the oxygen is. It's just easier to have bass control at a much lower level. So I would call this fun bass. It sounds fine, but do be aware that if you were looking for something super tight and super fast because it's a new driver, it could be a little faster and a little more defined and give you a little more texture if it had a reduced level. So the mids, quite good, and I don't necessarily have too much of a complaint with the mids at all. Maybe it's a bit too clean, it's a bit not textured enough, but for a $15 set, quite detailed, quite nice to listen to, and I will nitpick it. And not so much that the mids have any issue, or sort of. My only issue would be her voice is a bit too high. And again, it's this peakiness, this brightness. For me, in my ears, it tends to drag the voice a little higher, and it almost sounds a little nasal. And even on her voice, you'll hear a touch of sibilance when you listen to it really closely. I think right around 30 seconds, when she drags out that S, it sounds a little bit sibilant to me compared to other sets, but super nitpick on that. But what I notice more than the mids themselves are what's around the mids. And when you listen to the piano and the bass and that drum brush, they all should be supporting her voice and should not even be close to the level of her voice. So think about, her singing in front of the band. She should be front and center. She is the center of attention. Her voice should be quite separated from the other three instruments. And with sort of this U-shaped, where you're bringing up the bass level, you're bringing up the piano, and then that drum brush, which is way out here, it's kind of super distracting. I hear all those kind of at the same level as her voice, and it's a bit distracting. So nothing particularly wrong with the mids. I think everything around the mids just needs to be a little more balanced and not competing with her voice and the mids. So that'll be my nitpick complaint on that. So treble, extended, detailed, very much in the upper range, and is very smooth with this late rise. Like I said, for those of you who may be into, or this upper mid emphasis, if it tends to ever be shouty for you, this more gentle rise into 4K is much easier to deal with. So do take that into consideration, that if maybe you tried a past KZ in the past and it was a bit shouty, this is not going to be like that. It's a much smoother rise into the treble area. So smooth late rise avoids shoutiness, not harsh. There's a very minimal sibilance, but for me, like I said, it can be peaky and way too much at higher volumes. But very much a wow factor, something kind of new for a KZ. And for me, I would say it still needs to be listenable for long sessions, which I have an issue with. So two quick examples. So these higher frequency instruments are quite distracting for me. So Jennifer Warren's Bird on a Wire is really okay up until 218, and then those drums kick in, and the whole thing gets very fatiguing and too intense for me. Same thing, Blink 182, all the small things. Right in the beginning, those guitars are just piercing, and the whole song is actually quite fatiguing for me. And again, back to number one, this is probably a my issue, not a you issue. If your girlfriend ever broke up with you and said, it's me, not you, I'm very much telling you the same exact thing. This is probably me and not you, and you're probably not going to experience it, but I will mention it because it's hard to describe the treble without explaining how I hear it. So those two songs really hit it pretty hard for me. So stage and imaging, pretty average, nothing too crazy wide, but there is nice height and depth, and it does quite well for $15. It's kind of amazing for $15 actually, but and like I said, imaging is fine, especially on the lower, slower tracks, but a lot of higher frequencies, like up here, everything starts to blur together and I lose separation. It's just a little bit too much for me, and it becomes a little bit overwhelming. So that is it. That is my quick take on the CRA. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.